All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started with the next talk here. I'm Hainline, and I work in science and technology for many years for Raytheon. I work with a lot of people with PhDs in math and science. I don't have a PhD myself, but I kind of know where they're coming from. I have a lot of interactions with scientists, and I do have a degree in physics from UT Austin and did some graduate work at Biola in the science and religion program where they try to teach us a lot about the science that in particular relates to evidence for God and things like that. And so that's kind of the backdrop of what we'll be talking about. And I do want to mention, though, to start with, really my personal story, because I'm very passionate about this area because I went through a period of doubts a number of years ago, back in the late 90s, where even though I grew up in the church, had a great upbringing, was very active even in evangelism in college, different things like that. But I went through kind of a dry spell where I started doubting, and a big part of that doubt was the question of why are all these incredibly smart scientists skeptical about God? And some of the things that I had been taught in the church seemed to kind of go against science. And it really, the combination of those factors, and I had some friends that lost their faith that were very close, strong Christian followers, they walked away from their faith. And it got me questioning, well, how do I know that this whole thing is true? And I struggled with that. And so I appreciate what Pastor Mark shared earlier about trying to confront doubts, get help, get answers. And I discovered as I studied things that there are good answers to the questions I have, and that actually there's this whole body of evidence from science that you're not even taught about in church, really, but it gives you very clear indicators that we need a creator, that we need God to account for the natural world that we see. And so what was a weakness for me became something that I wanted to get involved with ministry-wise. Are you guys hearing me okay? Okay. So what I did, I kind of adopted it as a ministry. It's sort of like, the person that was a former drug addict. He's the one that feels led to help other people that struggle. Well, I feel led to help anybody that's struggling with doubts, if there's a Christian setting with doubts, or also try to help those who are skeptical, that find maybe their scientific understandings getting in the way of Christianity. And so that's the area that I feel really called to help people in. And so, I want to share a few things with you this afternoon in this area of God and science. And so let's start with a little philosophy, though, because I think philosophy undergirds every aspect, and that's often where things go wrong. And so, for example, the claim that science has disproven God, something that bothered me when I went through this period of doubts a number of years ago. Okay, suppose there was absolutely no scientific evidence for God. Do you think that would be reason enough to think that God doesn't exist, if science told us nothing at all positive about God existing? Or do you think science ever could disprove God? And I think the answer clearly is no. Science could never disprove God, and that you could be fully justified in believing in God even if we had no evidence whatsoever from science for God. Now, I think we do. I'm going to give you some of that evidence later. But suppose we didn't. I still think it's incredibly justified to believe in God. And Mark touched on some of the reasons. We have all these arguments from philosophy. We have evidence of fulfilled prophecies in the Bible. I'd love to give a talk just on that, about these incredible things where it talks about Babylon will be destroyed and never be rebuilt, or Memphis and Thebes. The future of all these different cities is talked about in the Bible in very clear ways, not just that had to be fulfilled in the past, but require a continual fulfillment today. It's really just mind-boggling, the level of evidence in all these different areas. Okay, so I think we can be fully justified by believing God even if we had nothing from science. But in fact, we do. Stay with me on that. But if you think about what someone is really claiming, if they say science has disproven God, they're really claiming then that science would be the only source of knowledge. Because they're not saying, well, we don't think there's evidence from science, and we've looked at the evidence from history, and we've shown that's faulty. They're just saying science has disproven God. That's completely mistaken, and even just understanding what our theory of knowledge is, how we acquire knowledge. Obviously, science is not the only source of knowledge. In fact, in order to do science, you have to have logic and math, and even ethics plays a role in science. If scientists lie about their findings, you can't make progress. So science depends on all kinds of other things. Anyway, it's not the sole source of knowledge. And to say that it is self-defeating, because the claim that science has shown that there's no knowledge outside of science is not itself a scientific claim. It's as self-refuting as this snake here eating itself. If you apply the claim to itself, it self-destructs, basically. A good analogy that I think Ed Fazer came up with, a philosopher, he talked about how it's sort of like a metal detector. So a metal detector is great at detecting metals, but what does it tell us about plastics, for example? Nothing, right? In the same way, science is great at discovering natural laws, telling us about how nature works, but it's not at all geared towards the supernatural. It doesn't tell us that there's nothing supernatural, no matter how well we understand nature and nature's laws. That does not tell us anything about whether there could be a supernatural creator that set up all these laws of nature. So I think that's mistaken, and I came to realize later that I had too narrow a view of knowledge. I was too influenced by the professors or coworkers I had and what they were trying to make claims about by putting science up on this pedestal and not realizing the limits of science. The other thing that you sometimes hear that can be a problem is that science and Christianity have had this long history of warfare. That, over time, science keeps chipping away at what we used to think had a religious explanation, and now we have a scientific explanation, or that there's this kind of conflict. And in fact, I think this is the reason why many scientists, they don't know much about Christianity, but they're very anti-Christian because they think that Christianity opposes science. And that's based on a very much a misunderstanding of history. In fact, here's an atheist historian, Timothy O'Neill. First of all, he talks about how the Dark Ages there never really was anything that should be called the Dark Ages. Often, skeptics will try to talk about the Middle Ages, this period when a lot of Western Europe was Christian, but not all of it. And, it's sometimes said by people, this was this period of darkness where they didn't have truth. They didn't care about truth. They were just all superstitious people. Well, that's something that came up much later during the Enlightenment. It's more of a propaganda redefinition of history. There never was. In fact, that period was a time of great discovery that kind of led up and got the scientific revolution going later. You can trace back now a lot of the things that influenced people like Newton came actually out of this period of the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages. No one called it that during that time, of course. And so also atheist historian Timothy O'Neill says this conflict thesis of a historical war between science and theology has long since been overturned. Okay, so there really never was this long history because, in fact, the science was founded in a Christian culture in Western Europe. And it was no coincidence. Even secular historians will admit that it was because of the Christian views that they were led to look for law in nature. They believed in a law-giving God, and they looked for it in nature, and they found it. And that was no coincidence. China was way ahead in some ways in technology, but they never developed science. They didn't initially develop science. That came out of the Christian worldview. And about 48 of the top 50 people that originated science were actually Christians. Even though a lot of people didn't go to church actually during that period of time when science, the people that were scientists weren't just nominal Christians, they were very devout. If you read Kepler, you'll see prayers interspersed with his astronomical observations. So now let's get into a little bit of the evidence, though. And the first point I'd like to make is that, let's start at the very beginning. I want to look a lot, in fact, at the foundations of science and examine at the deepest level, what is science really telling us? So a natural place to start would simply be the origin of the universe. Was there an origin, or as many atheists thought, has the universe just been around forever? I remember hearing Carl Sagan say that years ago on Cosmos. The universe is all there is and ever was, and he would just try to say the universe has just been around forever. But really, we now know that that is false. The best science that we have today would indicate that the universe had to have a beginning. And this is much more general than just saying, hey, we have evidence for the Big Bang. I have no problem with the Big Bang. I know some Christians are kind of leery of it a little bit. I think that it may have just been an explanation of a creation event. But even if that theory is wrong, the more important point is that At the most fundamental levels of science, we have evidence that the universe could not have been here forever. So for example, let's say that I had a cup of coffee sitting out here and you could see steam coming from it. And I told you, I left that here last week when I was here. Now you would know immediately that could not be the case, right? Because it would have cooled off by now. And in the same way, the second law of thermodynamics, if you want to get technical, there's fundamental principles in science that would show us that the universe would have already reached an equilibrium. There would be no life possible, nothing interesting happening if the universe had in fact been here forever. You wouldn't have things like stars burning. They would have all burned up. They have a finite lifetime. The usable energy is going to nothing. And this has been extended even in spite of quantum mechanics. There's actually other reasons that atheists would call a proof that there was a beginning. Here was an interesting article that came out in this very pro-evolutionary science popular level journal in which it says why physicists can't avoid a creation event. Now that's a pretty provocative title, right? Because often the scientists would, say, oh, you creationists, it's like a term of derision. They make fun of us because we believe in a creation. Well, science says there was a creation of the universe. It's very clear on that. And as this says here, even if the Big Bang was not the beginning, there had to be a beginning for these more fundamental reasons. So even if you think the Big Bang is wrong, there's more deep reasons from within science that tell us the universe can't have been here forever. All right, so I would like to introduce another line of evidence, one that I sort of specialize in. It's called fine-tuning. So let me tell you a little bit about what fine-tuning is. You can think of the universe as sort of like a biosphere. In fact, a number of years ago, they tried to build a self-contained environment for life in Arizona. I see some heads nodding. You might remember they were, this would be a great thing if you could set it up. Potentially you could transport that to the moon or Mars, and you could have colonies of life living off of it, right? If you could have some self-contained area where plants could grow and you could maintain levels of oxygen and things like that. So they tried to do that even just here on the planet Earth to start with, and it failed. It was very difficult even to provide this kind of environment for life. Now, what was really interesting though is physicists have applied that to the entire universe and looked at, well, what properties does the universe need for life? What would happen if we change things? In this discipline of theoretical physics, we do this all the time. We look at, what would happen if gravity was a little stronger, or this particle mass? What if electrons had a greater mass? You might think that wouldn't really matter, but it turns out that in fact it would ruin the possibility of life anywhere in the universe if you had tiny changes to these fundamental laws of nature. So that's what we mean by fine-tuning. You can think of it sort of like, a giant room like here with these control knobs adjusting how strong these forces are or what the attributes of various fundamental particles of which everything else is made. And it turns out that the set of possible physical laws, parameters, and initial conditions that permit life is just ridiculously small. That was the summary statement by one of the world's experts in this field, Luke Barnes. He's an astronomer in Australia, PhD from Cambridge University, the top science university in Europe, I would say. And he's written this book that you can't see it. It's me pointing to it, but the top right there, Fortunate Universe. Highly recommended book if you really want to get in deep on this fine-tuning evidence. But he co-authored it with an atheist, and they agree on all the physics, minus one little footnote. But they disagree, of course, on the implications. His friend, that's also a professor, is still a skeptic, unfortunately, but he acknowledges that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned for life. And he opts for this, he appeals to unknown other universes out there and this hope that maybe we just got lucky. If you had enough other universes with different laws, eventually you would have one that would support life. It's called the multiverse. Okay, so that's the best they can come up with. There's no evidence for any universe other than our own, and it puts it out of the realm of any kind of scientific discovery because these other universes would have no causal contact with our universe. So it's interesting that you have top atheists appealing to things like that. It's no less metaphysical than the concept of God, who we also think is above and beyond the universe, but at least in the case of God, we believe we have evidence that he has causally interacted with the universe, obviously. So I think the better explanation is obviously God. But again, so the interesting thing about this is the evidence that I'm giving you from fine-tuning. It's not controversial within science. Some of the other evidence I'll give you later is a little bit, but this is very much widely accepted, at least by experts in the field, those that really have studied it. And so let me tell you a little bit more about it. And we can start with something that actually ties into the early universe. If you look at all the ways to arrange particles in the early universe, it turns out almost all of them would have resulted in a universe devoid of life because it would have been just all one big black hole. As you probably know, a black hole is this highly dense area where light itself can't even escape from gravity. And so that would be very prohibitive to life. Anything like that, you would have no energy source emanating from a black hole of which you could do photosynthesis for plants or things of that nature. And it would also messes up orbits. Anything close to a black hole is catastrophic. You might have seen some of that in movies, and it's even worse than they make it out to be in the movies, actually. But the interesting thing about this fine-tuning is that here you have a non-religious scientist. He first came up with this. Others have affirmed it. It's not controversial. But he puts the level of fine-tuning required to just this mind-blowing number. 1 in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. So if you were to write that number out, the number of zeros would actually be more than are the number of subatomic particles in the universe. You could take every proton, neutron, electron, or even the particles that make up protons and neutrons and use that as a zero. You still wouldn't have enough of them to just write out that number in standard form. So this is a ridiculous level of improbability. So I think this fact also, if there was ever any doubt that the origin of the universe was an act of creation by God, this should, settle the issue for anybody that's open-minded about it, I think. And the other thing radical about, and I probably should have mentioned this, but the other thing radical about the origin of the universe, as understood by modern physics, is actually that there's a beginning not just to matter and energy, but also to space and time. So that's really hard to get your mind around. Like if you go back in time, you eventually reach a point at which there is no more moment before that. Or you go back and the space of the universe goes back to basically zero. So if you think about it from the standpoint of an atheist or a naturalist, someone that believes nature is all there is, what could possibly cause an origin of the universe? Because everything in your worldview came into being at a point of time in the past. You would have zero resources for creating a universe out of nothing. Okay? Nothing comes from nothing. We don't need to get that deep into philosophy to recognize that fundamental principle. All right, so other examples of fine-tuning. It's not just the way the universe was set up initially, but it's also at the level of all the laws and the constants that govern the laws. So you have a law of gravity, that things attract based on their mass. There's a certain strength associated with that. There's nothing in the underlying theory that forces it to a certain value. We just have to go and measure it by experiment. What happens if that was different? Well, physicists can easily compute that and discover that if it was a little bit different, it could mess up things like stars, star formation. Similarly, the strength of electromagnetism, which is what is really holding your body together right now, as that force. If you change that a little bit, that can really mess things up as well. All right, so it turns out all the 4 fundamental forces, every particle that you've probably ever heard of, has this kind of fine-tuning. Some of them to a mind-boggling level, some of them a little bit more modest, but nevertheless finely tuned. So I'm going to just kind of break it down with one example here that might help you. Okay, this one has a good way of kind of intuitively seeing the need for fine-tuning. If you think about stars, okay, stars are pretty important to life, right? If you knocked out the sun, how long would we go on the earth? Not that long. It would cool off a lot more rapidly than you might even think. And you would stop having any plants grow and the food chain would break down. It would just be horrible, right? You've got to have stars, some kind of sustained energy source for life. Okay, it turns out that making stars requires a lot of fine-tuning, especially if you want them to be stable and long-lived. So by contrast, let's think about what a star is first. A star is basically a controlled nuclear explosion held together by gravity. All right? And when you think about nuclear explosions, what do you think? Usually it's a very instantaneous thing, right? When we humans set off a nuclear bomb, that's it. It's just, and how much more power is there in something like the sun than even those bombs? All right, so why is it that our sun can last so long into the future? It turns out that there's some fine-tuning associated with minimizing the rate of releasing of heat from the sun. So an interesting contrast is thinking about the sun versus yourself. Now, obviously, the sun is a lot more energetic than any of us, but we are hotter than the ambient room temperature here. We're at 98.6. Hopefully, none of you are sick and have a fever. But you're putting out heat into the room, right? And so there's a certain amount of energy release even from a human being. So if you take that energy release and you divide it by the mass of a human, by the weight, and compare that to the energy release of the sun divided by its weight, which is bigger? It turns out the sun puts out less energy per unit mass than do you. Now that's just mind-boggling, right? It's doing all these nuclear reactions. Why is it that it's such a slow energy release? Now it's still enormous because it's much more massive than we are, right? You can fit 1 million Earths into the sun. It's an enormous amount of mass there. But there's some fine-tuning associated with slowing down that energy release. So it turns out this is fine-tuning if you calculate it conservatively, as my friend Luke Barnes has. It's about 1 part in 10 to the 35th power in terms of the amount of fine-tuning, the adjusting of these knobs. If you look at what they could have been set to versus what they are set to, it's like 1 with 35 zeros after it. Now that's still a really big number. It's hard to get your mind around that, so I did some calculations. I computed, well, how big would a sand pile be if it had 10 to the 35th grains of sand? And so I started with the continents of Europe and Asia, and I looked at if you just built a sand pile straight up, you probably couldn't really do this because it would cave in, but if you could just go vertically, how high up would that sand pile be before you would get this number of grains of sand? And it turns out, oh yeah, I don't have that animated. I got rid of my animations. It turns out it goes all the way to the moon, an enormous distance. So that's a lot of grains of sand, right? So then you can think about this thought experiment. What if you painted one of them red and you mixed it up at random? You took somebody blindfolded and said, you have one chance, choose a grain of sand. What are the odds they get the red grain of sand? It's 1 in 10 to the 35th power. In fact, it's actually a little bit less probable than that. But I was being conservative here. So do you think that happened by chance? Do you think that the laws of our universe were set by chance? It does not look that way. And this isn't even the most finely tuned parameter. This is just one that I think people can understand, the concept of stars and how they might need to be finely tuned to be stable and last a long time. And just to show you, here's an atheist scientist. He was very prominent, PhD from Harvard. And he says even just to have stars at all requires fine-tuning to about 1 part in 10 to the 229th power. So Luke Barnes and we're being way more conservative. These are really solid numbers of fine-tuning than even what some of the atheists out there are putting it at. So that does not look like something by chance. These are reasons for thinking that we need God to have set up the laws of nature at very foundational level for there to be life. There was purpose in how the laws were set up. They weren't just set up at random. Okay, so that's physics. It's kind of the most foundational science. But what about chemistry? Let's look at the very bottom of chemistry. Is it possible that if you change the fundamental parameters of the universe, you would have ruined it for chemistry? And actually, it turns out, yes. There's many ways in which we could not have chemistry if the strong force, which holds together the nucleus, was too strong, or the electromagnetic force, which is what helps keep the electrons orbiting, if you will, around the nucleus. If that was too weak, you wouldn't have anything but hydrogen. That would be the only element of the periodic table. I know some of you might be thinking, oh great, chemistry would be a lot easier, right, if I just had one element to remember. But the problem is you wouldn't be here if we just had one element, because there's no chemistry if you just have hydrogen. So that would ruin the universe for any possible life or even any chemistry. And in fact, there's even more fundamental things than that. There's ways in which you might not even have protons. A hydrogen is really just a proton with usually an electron around it. but there's ways of tweaking the forces such that you wouldn't even have that, or that you would have all neutrons, and in which case also you wouldn't have chemistry. It also turns out, you might have heard of quantum mechanics, which is, the physics that usually is associated with the physics of the very small, but really it applies to everything. But if you didn't have quantum mechanics, no atoms would be stable. Atoms would decay in less than a trillionth of a second. So we need all these different aspects of science. They're not just, random things that it's just the way it is. It looks like they were set up by a creator with a purpose in mind. There's also coincidences associated with the getting reasonable amounts of carbon and oxygen to even exist. But I want to turn a little bit of attention to biology. So we've talked about physics and chemistry. Those of you in school, those are the three main areas of science, right? Physics, chemistry, biology. Let's talk about biology. What's the foundation of biology? Well, that would be the origin of life. For there to be biology, you need to have an origin of life from non-life. All right? Is that the kind of thing that would happen? Do we just expect to happen through natural causes? Or is that something where maybe God would have had to have intervened? And I think over time, it's become more and more clear that, in fact, we definitely need God to bring about life from non-life. It's not something that would be expected to happen naturally. For example, this book here, Origins of Life, I'd highly recommend it. It discusses all the problems with trying to get to life, to get to even a single cell from, say, the early Earth and what the atmosphere was like, what things were like. And there was actually a chemist who was a Nobel Prize winner that read this book. He was a skeptic at the time, but he realized after reading the book that, there's no way this could happen. Now, chemistry is the discipline that would be most relevant to understanding if origin of life could happen from non-life. Because you're appealing basically just can the chemistry of the early Earth give you life? And the answer, I think, pretty clearly is no. This man did become a Christian. Eventually, he went from non-belief to theism and then to Christianity. I actually gave this talk at UT Dallas, and one of our students said that he knows this guy's son. He's from the Houston area, so that was kind of interesting. He taught at Rice University. All right, what are some atheists say about this? Well, one that's honest with the evidence is Eugene Koonin. He's from the former Soviet Union. He admits that getting a living cell capable of evolving, and that's what you'd need if you're going to explain all of life without God. You have to get a cell, and it's got to be able to evolve in some way. He said it's 1 in 10 to the 1018th power. Okay, so think about my sand analogy. That was 1 in 10 to the 35th power. So this is like doing that sand analogy like 30 times in a row and getting it right each time. That's just ridiculously improbable. And he actually appeals to this kind of multiverse scenario as well, even though that's out of his expertise. Similarly, one of the top chemists in the world is considered to be Dr. Whitesides of Harvard. And he points out that the origin of life is really much worse than just getting a chicken from soup. It's actually much more difficult than that, because if you think about the soup that would have existed, it would be on this early Earth, very chaotic environment, where you've got these oceans where it would dilute anything that might be accumulating in the way of organic compounds. And he just has no clue. He admits we have no idea how this could have happened. All right, and just a couple more quick points in closing here. There's a lot more that could be said on any one of these topics. I literally have like 150 slides just on fine-tuning, but I'm just giving you guys some highlights just so you know some of the evidence out there. And this one is more personal. If you think about the nature of who we are as humans, I think you can quickly see that science and just assuming nature is all there is could really never explain us as humans. And namely, I want to appeal to two areas, free will and consciousness. And here's a book by one of the top atheists, very popular, Sam Harris, a book on free will. He makes a very good case, but he starts from assumptions that are atheistic. He assumes if nature is all there is, that you wouldn't have free will. I agree with him. But I also disagree, though, that I think we actually do have free will. I feel like I'm doing the equivalent of a science experiment all the time, where I'm directing my body, it's doing what I tell it to do. I think that we clearly know that we have free will, and so if your worldview demands that you don't, I think you should question that worldview. the whole question you want to look into in an evidential search is which worldview best explains reality. And I think clearly the Christian worldview does, by contrast with atheism or naturalism, or even in some cases, some of the other religions. You can distinguish Christianity from those in various ways, even just from the scientific evidence. It's interesting to look at how even these skeptics, they don't even live according to their own beliefs. This guy, Rodney Brooks, he said, a person is just a bag of skin full of biomolecules. And he admits, though, he doesn't treat his children that way. They have my unconditional love. And he says that this is not based on rational analysis. He maintains two sets of inconsistent beliefs. So again, he should be questioning his worldview because of that. Similarly, and again, this is not just some random atheist guy. Daniel Dennett is one of the so-called horsemen, as Sam Harris was. But he calls consciousness an illusion. But an illusion is a state of consciousness. And I think you could be no more certain of anything than that you're conscious. Even if you were a brain living in a vat, and all these were deceived, you would still have some conscious experience. You can't deny consciousness. I think that's just ridiculous. And he might try to caveat it, but notice the talk title he chose was The Illusion of Consciousness, in which his talk basically is getting into things like, there's these optical illusions, sometimes you can be deceived. But that does nothing to disprove the fact that you are conscious. All right. And just briefly, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, if some of you all are maybe bothered by evolution, doesn't evolution disprove the Bible or Christianity? Well, there's a lot of problems with evolution. And if you look deeply at the peer-reviewed articles, they'll be more honest about these than will your textbooks. But there's this effort underway not to reveal some of the problems out there. But even Darwin admitted that everything in his theory has to be able to be explained by a small sequence of steps, each of which has an advantage. And that's the very thing that we have evidence against now, clearly. And if you look at what's predicted on his theory, a nice little ordered tree here, versus the tree that they end up drawing to try to chain together, well, we think this organism came from this one. It's really messed up. In fact, again, here's a very pro-evolutionary magazine admitting Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life. So the evidence is just not there in the way that you're often taught in school. And it's not to say that no evolution occurs. There can be microevolution. It's worth studying some things. But this notion that humans came from single-celled organisms through this unguided natural process is really not warranted scientifically at all. And part of what they struggle to explain, they don't explain at all, is how you get all these molecular machines that are more sophisticated than anything that humans can make even today in the 21st century. It's just mind-boggling. These are the kind of things that you need. You got to have all the parts working together before it can be functional. So how could you have this gradualistic explanation? Probably need more time to do this justice, but one example of a molecular machine that's gotten a lot of attention within the intelligent design community is this bacterial flagellum. It's really an outboard motor, and you can see it spinning there, but it's way better than the motors that we produce. So if you think in terms of, we have rotary engine cars, that's kind of the same concept as here, but they don't spin nearly as fast. And if I'm driving a Mazda rotary engine car and I take it from going on the highway at 70 miles an hour and I flip it into reverse, I'm going to drop that transmission, and you're going to be in big trouble with your parents if you ever do that. So I don't recommend it. Whereas this thing, it can stop, it can be going full speed, 100,000 rotations per minute, and within a quarter of a rotation, it can stop and start going the opposite direction. So just unbelievable machines. And even this Harvard biologist says it's the most efficient machine in the universe, nearly 100% efficient. Our gas engines are more like 15% or something like that. We're getting a little better over time, but whole different story. And then to assemble this is also what we might call irreducibly complex, not the kind of thing that could have evolved. It would be like, one biologist compared it to assembling a satellite antenna, a dish on your roof without ever leaving the house. Because that's what this has to do. This bacteria has to put it on the outside of the cell, and it's all through this automated process. There's no one there to, it's just chemicals. So you've got a very specific ordering of the proteins. So they really have no clue how this could have evolved. And many of these molecular machines, not all of them, but many of them have to be there at the beginning for evolution to occur. For example, the ribosome that makes proteins, it's got to be there from day one. Every cell has it. So there's just no explanation for this. And I'm like 2 minutes over, but this is my last slide. Just kind of showing the summary here. In physics, we've shown that without design, there's no creation of the universe. You wouldn't have things like stable structures or stars. You wouldn't even have chemistry without fine-tuning. And then in biology, we've shown that, or I haven't really shown it, I guess, but I encourage you, if you go and read that book and read some of the top scientists, you'll see that this is, what I'm saying is truthful. But that there's no explanation for how life could arise from non-life, and that there's been no plausible, even remotely plausible explanation for the origin of the molecular machines that would have to be there to get evolution going. And then that human persons, there's no way on naturalism to account even for, I think, for the existence of those things which reflect us being made in the image of God, like free will and consciousness. They can't, much less can they can't explain the existence and much less the origin of those. It's just totally beyond anything that science, I think, can or ever will do. And there's even non-religious scientists that will admit as much, like Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers and others. So that's the last slide, but I would love to talk to anybody that has questions, and we can do that in Q&A. And if anybody wants to get my business card and ask anything over email, again, I want to help anybody with doubts and that kind of a thing. So thank you for your attention.